My friends, I need you to hear me carefully, because what I'm about to share is not just a message, it is a warning, a revelation, and a call. In the early hours I was awakened, not by a sound, not by a voice in the natural, but by a weight in my spirit so strong that it felt like the very air had shifted. And in that moment I knew. God was showing me something. I saw a date, August 13, 2025. It was not just written, it was engraved before me as if time itself had marked it out for a purpose. And then images began to pour in. I saw a shaking not just of the ground, but of nations. I saw systems, structures, and powers that thought themselves immovable begin to tremble. But hear me, this was not simply about destruction. It was about exposure. The hidden was being brought into the light. What had been done in secret was suddenly laid bare before the eyes of all. And yet there was more. Amid the shaking, I saw a remnant small, but burning bright. People who refused to bow to fear, who held on to truth when lies became the air everyone breathed. And over them there was a covering, as if unseen hands shielded them from what others could not escape. I tell you this not to stir panic, but to awaken urgency. This is a time to draw near to God, to purify what has been compromised, to stand on what cannot be shaken. August 13, 2025 is not a day to dread, it is a day to be ready. When that day comes, the world may see chaos, but those who are prepared will see confirmation of what God has already spoken. I will shake all things, but my kingdom will stand forever. When I say the date is marked by God, I do not mean it in a casual or symbolic sense. I mean that in prayer, in a place of quiet before Him, this date came with a weight that could not be dismissed. It was not something I had been thinking about, nor was it connected to anything on my personal calendar. It appeared as if placed before me from beyond myself, a moment in time already carved into the fabric of history, waiting to be revealed. Dates in God's purposes are not accidents. Throughout the Scriptures, we see moments when God assigns significance to a specific day. The day the flood came upon the earth, the day Israel crossed the Jordan, the day the Spirit fell at Pentecost. These were not random. They were appointed times, foretold in heaven before they unfolded on earth. In the same way, August 13, 2025 is not simply another square on the calendar. It carries a sense of divine appointment, as though heaven itself has circled it in bold ink. That marking is not for curiosity's sake, but for preparation. The human mind tends to look forward to certain days for celebration, for routine events, or for deadlines of our own making. But when God marks a day, it is because He intends to act, and His actions are never without purpose. When I sensed this date, I also sensed the seriousness behind it. There was no feeling of casual interest, no sense that it could be ignored or postponed. It came with the same urgency as a watchman's trumpet in the night, summoning the city to awaken before the approaching storm. That does not mean the date will bring an event everyone will recognize immediately. Sometimes God marks a date because it begins a process, a shift, or a chain of events that will unfold in the days, weeks, and months to follow. I do not claim to know every detail of what will happen, but I do know that God does not waste His warnings. When He highlights a time, it is because His people must be in position. In the past, when God revealed the timing of something to His servants, it was so they could prepare, stand, and be aligned with His will when the moment arrived. Noah built the ark before the rain began. Joseph stored grain before the famine. Esther fasted before she went before the king. The marking of time by God is always a gift not to create fear, but to stir readiness. What does readiness look like? It is not simply stocking supplies or making plans in the natural. It is first and foremost a spiritual posture. It means examining your life for compromise, returning to the place of prayer, anchoring yourself in truth so deeply that when the shaking comes, you are not moved. It means being attentive to the Spirit, sensitive to His leading, and willing to act when He says move. Readiness is also corporate. The body of believers must be united, encouraging one another, and standing together against the tide of fear and deception that often follows times of upheaval. So when I tell you that August 13, 2025 is marked by God, I am telling you that we have been given a window of time between now and then, a window to repent where we have drifted, to strengthen what has grown weak, and to prepare our hearts to hear His voice clearly when that day comes. This is not about superstition or guessing games. This is about recognizing that the author of time has given us a signal, and ignoring it would be like ignoring the siren before the wave. The date is marked not for doom, but for alignment. And if we use this time well, we will not be shaken when the day arrives, but will stand as witnesses to what God is doing in our generation. When the word came about August 13, 2025, it was not simply that the date was marked, but that it was accompanied by a vision of shaking. It was not the shaking of a single place, nor the tremor of a small disturbance. It was a global shaking, the kind that reaches into the foundations of nations and causes even the most stable powers to tremble. I saw it not just as a physical event, but as a multi-layered disruption, political, economic, cultural, and spiritual. It was as if the things humanity has trusted in for decades, even centuries, were suddenly put to the test. Systems we assumed would always stand were strained to their breaking point. Leaders who seemed untouchable found themselves exposed and powerless. Markets that had been the pride of nations buckled under invisible pressure. And perhaps most telling, the confidence of the people began to crumble. Shaking is not a new concept in the ways of God. Throughout history, He has allowed and even initiated times when the structures of the world are unsettled. Not because He delights in chaos, but because shaking is the tool that separates the temporary from the eternal. It is the moment when false securities collapse, and the only unshakable foundation, His kingdom, remains standing. In the vision, the shaking was not random. It had direction, purpose, and intention. Every wave of disturbance seemed aimed at exposing the truth. Nations were confronted with the corruption they had long hidden. Movements and ideologies that had paraded themselves as righteous were unmasked, their roots laid bare. Yet this was not just a shaking of the wicked, it was a shaking of all things. Even those who follow God felt the tremors, because shaking tests the strength of every foundation. Houses built on sand, no matter how beautiful they appear, cannot endure the pressure. This was why the vision carried such urgency. It was a warning to prepare before the shaking intensified. For once it begins in full force, the time for building will be replaced by the time for standing. The shaking I saw was also deeply personal. It reached into the hearts of individuals, confronting the compromises we have made with convenience, the lies we have allowed to dwell unchallenged, and the idols we have quietly erected in our own lives. No one was entirely outside its reach, for its purpose was to strip away all that could not remain. For some, this was terrifying, for others, it was liberating. Those who had built on the rock found themselves unafraid, their footing secure even as the world swayed. But those who had relied on lesser foundations discovered, often painfully, that what they had trusted in could not hold them. The vision made it clear. The shaking is both judgment and mercy. Judgment, because it confronts evil and demands an accounting. Mercy, because it removes illusions and gives people the chance to see reality before it is too late. God's shaking is never without hope. Even in the turbulence, He is calling people back to Himself, away from the false promises of systems that were never designed to save. Between now and that day, we have been given an opportunity. The shaking has not yet reached its full measure. The tremors may already be felt in certain places, but the great wave is still on the horizon. This is the time to reinforce what is weak, to abandon what is corrupt, and to stand on what is eternal. It is the time to remember that kingdoms rise and fall, economies surge and collapse, leaders come and go, but the word of the Lord endures forever. When the shaking comes in its fullness, many will panic, for their trust will have been in things that cannot last. But those who have prepared will not only stand, they will shine as beacons in the darkness, pointing to the only foundation that will not move. This is why the warning matters, not to frighten, but to awaken, not to destroy, but to purify. The shaking is coming, and its purpose is to make clear to the whole earth that only one kingdom is unshakable. When the vision unfolded, it became clear that the shaking was not only about collapse or instability, it was about a great uncovering. It was as though a heavy curtain, which for years had concealed what was happening behind the scenes, was suddenly torn down. In an instant, the hidden things were brought into the light. The secrecy that had allowed corruption to thrive was shattered, and nothing, no matter how carefully disguised, could remain concealed. It was not simply that lies were exposed, it was that the entire system of deception itself was dismantled. I saw leaders standing before the world, their faces pale, as the truth they had worked so hard to bury became public knowledge. I saw organizations and movements that had been hailed as champions of justice revealed for what they truly were: hollow facades, built to manipulate rather than serve. Even institutions that had been respected for decades were shown to be compromised at their core. This exposure was relentless. It did not stop at the level of governments or corporations. It reached into media, education, entertainment, and even religious circles. Wherever there was pretense, wherever truth had been traded for gain, the light found it. The power of this unveiling was not in human investigation alone. This was not just the result of determined journalists or whistleblowers, though some of them played their part. This was a divine act of revelation, a moment in history when God Himself said, "Enough." In Scripture, we see Him do this repeatedly. He warned Israel through the prophets that their hidden sins would be shouted from the rooftops. Jesus declared that there is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, nothing hidden that will not be made known. What I saw was that very principle being played out on a global scale. But this exposure was not meant to humiliate for the sake of humiliation. It was meant to force a decision. When truth comes to light, the human heart must either repent or harden. Those who were willing to turn from their ways found mercy, but those who clung to their deceit found themselves crushed under the weight of it. The unveiling was both an invitation and a warning. You cannot walk in darkness and hope to stand when the light comes. The vision showed me that the exposure would also bring a kind of chaos, not because the truth itself is chaotic, but because many had built their entire reality on lies. When those lies collapse, it creates confusion and fear. People begin to question everything they thought they knew. Trust evaporates almost overnight, and yet, within that upheaval, there is also an opening for something new, for truth to take root where deception once held sway. For the people of God, this time of exposure will be both challenging and liberating. It will be challenging because some of the uncovering will hit close to home. There will be leaders and institutions we respected who will fall. There will be movements we supported that will be revealed as corrupt. And yet, It will be liberating because the removal of false coverings will allow the genuine to shine all the brighter. We will see a purer witness, a clearer truth, and a separation between what is truly of God and what only claimed to be. This exposure is a mercy because it gives people the chance to see reality before it is too late. To live under deception is to walk toward destruction without realizing it. But when the light comes, even though it may be painful, it offers the chance to turn, to change, to build again on a foundation that will stand. The vision impressed on me that we should not fear this exposure, but we must be ready for it. We must be willing to let God search our own hearts first, removing anything that would not withstand the light. Because when the hidden things are revealed on that scale, the world will not only be looking at governments and corporations, it will be looking at us. And in that moment, we must be found standing in truth, without shame, as witnesses to the one who is the light. In the vision, amid the shaking and the exposure, I saw something unexpected, a remnant. It was not a vast multitude, not the kind of crowd that commands headlines or political power, but a small, steadfast group scattered across the world. They stood in places others had abandoned, held to truths others had discarded, and kept their faith when fear had driven many to compromise. They were not marked by wealth, status, or influence, yet there was a strength in them that made them immovable. Even when the winds of chaos blew around them, they did not bow to the pressure. This remnant did not appear suddenly. They had been forged over time. Many of them had walked through seasons of testing, where they learned to trust God when nothing made sense. They had endured loss, rejection, and ridicule for refusing to bend to the world's demands. Some had been forgotten by others, overlooked in their communities, or dismissed by the powerful, but in the eyes of heaven they were precious. What made them different was not that they were flawless, but that they were surrendered. Their allegiance was not to a party, a movement, or even their own comfort. It was to God alone. I saw that these people were not isolated from the shaking. They felt its tremors like everyone else. They too had moments of uncertainty and days where the pressure weighed heavily. But unlike others, they did not allow fear to dictate their choices. Their lives were anchored in something deeper than the news, the markets, or the opinions of the masses. They had built their foundations on the unchanging promises of God, and because of that, they could stand when others fell. What struck me most was that this remnant was not loud in their strength. They were not the ones making the most noise or seeking to dominate every conversation. Their power was quiet but undeniable, like the rootedness of an old tree that has stood through countless storms. And yet, their presence had an impact far greater than their numbers. When others saw them standing without fear, it became a beacon of hope. When they spoke, their words carried weight because they came from a place of proven faith, not mere theory. This remnant was also marked by unity, but not the shallow kind that comes from shared preferences or temporary alliances. Their unity was forged in the fire of shared conviction and mutual dependence on God. They carried each other's burdens, prayed for one another, and stood together in the face of opposition. They were not perfect in their relationships, but they were committed to reconciliation and forgiveness, refusing to let division take root. In the vision, I sensed that this remnant had a special role in the events surrounding August 13, 2025. While much of the world would be shaken to its core, this small group would be used by God to guide others, to speak truth when deception was rampant, and to demonstrate peace when fear was overwhelming. They were not just survivors, they were carriers of hope. Even in the darkest moments, they would remind others that God had not abandoned the earth, and that his kingdom was still unshakable. What God impressed on me was that anyone could be part of this remnant, but it would require a choice now, before the full shaking came. It would mean laying down the idols of comfort and control, letting go of compromise, and committing to live by the truth no matter the cost. The remnant would not be formed in the moment of crisis, they would be revealed in it. The time before August 13 was a time to be forged, tested, and made ready. The world might overlook this group, but heaven does not. And in the days to come, their faithfulness will be the steady light guiding many through the storm. They may be few, but they will stand when others bow, and in their standing, they will testify to the faithfulness of the God who never shakes. In the vision, as the shaking intensified and the exposure swept across nations, I noticed something profound. Not everyone was left vulnerable to the chaos. Over a certain group of people, there was a covering, not a physical shelter of wood or stone, but something far more impenetrable. It was as if unseen hands had stretched a shield above them. The storms still raged around them, the noise of fear still filled the air, yet within that covering there was a calm that defied the circumstances. These were the faithful ones, those whose trust had been anchored in God long before the crisis began. This covering was not random, nor was it given by chance. It rested upon those who had chosen the narrow road, those who had walked in obedience even when it cost them. They were not spared from every difficulty. They still saw the trembling of the earth, still felt the pressure of the times, but they were spared from the destruction that overtook others. It was reminiscent of the way Israel was protected in the land of Goshen during the plagues of Egypt. The darkness covered the land, but light remained where God's people dwelled. Judgment swept through the nation, yet the blood on the doorposts mocked them for deliverance. In the vision, I could see that this divine protection was both a promise and a presence. It was not simply God altering circumstances from afar. It was His nearness that became their shield. It was His voice guiding them away from danger. It was His hand closing the door against the enemy's schemes. And because of this closeness, these people carried a peace that baffled those around them. Others looked at them and asked, "Why aren't you afraid? Don't you see what's happening?" And their answer was simple: "Yes, we see it, but we know who is with us." This protection was not about hiding from the world or retreating into isolation. Those under the covering were still active in their communities. They still interacted with those who were panicking, still spoke with those in confusion, still served those in need. In fact, their protection made them bold, because they knew their lives were in God's hands. They were like Daniel in Babylon, surrounded by a hostile environment, yet preserved by an invisible fortress. I understood in that moment that the covering was not something you could purchase or earn through human means. No wealth, influence, or status could buy it. It was granted to those who had surrendered fully to God, who walked in humility, who refused to compromise with darkness. And because they had built their lives on His word and His presence, when the storms came, they found themselves already in the shelter of the Almighty. The vision also showed that this covering would become a testimony. Many who had mocked faith or dismissed God's people would begin to notice the difference. While others lost hope, the protected ones stood in strength. While others grasped for control, the protected ones rested in trust. This visible distinction would cause questions to rise in the hearts of those outside the covering, and in that moment, opportunities would open for truth to be shared. Yet I also sensed a warning. The time to come under this covering is now. You do not wait until the storm is at your doorstep to seek shelter. You find the place of safety before the winds rise. The season before August 13, 2025 is not only about being aware of what is coming, it is about positioning yourself under God's protection. That means drawing near in prayer, walking in obedience, and refusing to step outside the boundaries He has set. It means trusting Him enough to let go of what He says to release, even if it makes no sense in the moment. Those under the covering in the vision did not get there by chance. They were there because they had learned, long before the shaking began, that there is no safer place than in the center of God's will. And when the day comes, they will be living proof that even in the midst of great shaking, His protection is real, His faithfulness is unshakable, and His people are never forsaken. The final part of the vision carried a tone that was both sobering and deeply hopeful. I sensed clearly that the purpose of what I was shown was not to stir fear for the sake of fear, nor to paralyze anyone with dread, but to awaken a holy urgency. August 13, 2025 was not presented as a day of random calamity, but as a moment in which choices, foundations, and loyalties would be tested. God was not giving this revelation so that people could hide away in panic. He was giving it so that they could prepare their hearts, align their lives, and be ready to stand in the midst of whatever unfolded. Readiness, as I understood it in the vision, was not primarily about physical preparation. While there is wisdom in being practical and discerning, the readiness God was speaking of went deeper. It was about the condition of the heart. It was about being spiritually awake, free from the numbness that comes when we are too comfortable in a world that is passing away. It was about living each day with the awareness that we are part of a kingdom that is unshakable, even as the kingdoms of this world are shaken. I saw that in the days leading up to that marked time, there would be two kinds of responses. Some would shrug it off, dismissing the warnings as unnecessary or exaggerated, choosing instead to continue as if nothing could change. Others would hear the call not with panic, but with resolve, and begin to strengthen their walk with God. These were the ones who would examine their lives honestly, repent of compromise, and realign with the truth. They would choose to let go of distractions and return to the simplicity of devotion to Him. The urgency in the vision was not born of fear, but of love. It was the kind of urgency you feel when you see a storm on the horizon, and you call your loved ones to safety before it hits. God was not sounding the alarm to frighten His people, but to protect them. He was saying, "Come closer to me now while there is time, so that you will not be shaken later." Those who responded would not be spared from every challenge, but they would be anchored in such a way that nothing could uproot them. The vision also made it clear that readiness was not an individual matter alone. This was a time for the people of God to strengthen each other, to encourage one another daily, and to stand together. Isolation would make many vulnerable, but community rooted in truth and love would make them strong. I saw believers meeting in small groups, praying together, worshiping, and sharing what God had shown them. In those moments of unity, there was a tangible strength, a shared courage that no amount of external pressure could diminish. When the day arrived in the vision, the difference between those who were ready and those who were not was stark. Those who had dismissed the call were tossed about like ships without anchors, easily swayed by fear and deception. But those who had prepared, those who had drawn near to God, built their lives on His word, and joined themselves to others walking in the same faith, stood with peace in their eyes, even as the world trembled. The message was unmistakable. Readiness is a choice. It does not happen by accident, and it cannot be manufactured at the last moment. It is the fruit of consistent steps of faith taken now. August 13, 2025 will be a day that reveals where our trust truly lies. For some, it will be a day of collapse. For others, it will be the confirmation that God's promises are unshakable. And in that moment, the faithful will shine not because they escaped the storm, but because they stood unshaken within it. The call is not to fear, but to be ready, and the time to be ready is now.